Rhineland, Germany, April 1945. 60 seconds to mob justice. The village square reeks of ash and rotting plaster, smoke curling from roofless walls like unanswered prayers. Lieutenant James Avery moves through the rubble, his Lee Enfield rifle slung low, boots crunching over shards of glass that were once a baker's window, a classroom, someone's Sunday morning. Then he sees her, a woman in a nurse's uniform, torn at the shoulder, streaked with mud and blood, bound to a wooden post in the center of the square. Above her head hangs a crude sign painted in harsh, block letters, Verraterend, traitor. Around her, a small but seething crowd gathers, 20, maybe 30 villagers, old men in threadbare coats, hollow-cheeked women, a child idly kicking gravel. Someone spits, the sound landing wet on stone. Avery feels the gravity of the moment before he even understands it, the rifle in his hands, the uniform that marks him as both liberator and enemy. The woman's head is bowed but she's still breathing. 60 seconds, that's all he has before someone in the crowd decides that waiting is worse than guilt. He isn't supposed to be here. His section was ordered to secure the eastern checkpoint, clear the roads, mark the mines, and let the village sort itself out. But a woman's cry pulled him in, sharp, sudden, and cut short by a hand or a fist. Avery signals to Corporal Doors to hold position, safety on, no shots. Then he steps into the square alone. The crowd turns. An old man in a stained Harvard coat steps forward, gesturing toward the woman as if she were evidence, an exhibit, proof. She helped your men, he spits. She gave them water while our boys bled. She is a traitor. Avery's heartbeat drums in his throat. He has stood in burning houses and felt calmer. But this is different. This is a village trying to cauterize its shame by burning the wound. He looks at the woman, her wrists raw where the rope bites. Her face is bruised, violet, and gray, but when her eyes lift to meet his, they are not pleading, they are exhausted, resigned. What happens next will test the thinnest line in war, the line between justice and murder, between orders and conscience, between the man you were taught to be and the man war demands you become. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, this is the kind of story that never makes the official histories. Hit that subscribe button, because every week we uncover the moral crucibles that define not just the war, but what it means to choose humanity when the world is choosing something else. Avery does not raise his rifle. Instead, he plants it against the cobblestone like a stake claiming ground. Halt! One word, in German, clipped and sharp as a parade command. The crowd freezes, not from fear, but from the sudden friction of interrupted momentum. They were a river, now they are water pooling. Poison, perhaps, or a test to see who was weak enough to accept enemy charity. The nurse noticed her hesitation and took a sip from her own cup. It's just tea, love. You're safe now. Safe. The word landed like a foreign object. Margaret drank. The warmth spread through her chest, and for the first time in months, her hands stopped shaking. She looked down at the mug, standard-issue British tin, dented on one side, the kind a soldier might carry through a campaign. It would become, in her memory, the symbol of everything that followed. Britain's treatment of prisoners of war was not accidental. It was policy, built on 4 pillars that senior command enforced with bureaucratic rigor. First, security. Prisoners behind wire posed no threat. Cruelty created resistance, decency created compliance. Second, intelligence. Her name, Avery repeats, slower now, letting the formality settle like frost. If you are executing her for treason, then you must know her name, her rank, her unit, the specific charges. Show me the court-martial documentation. Show me the Feldgendarmerie order. Show me anything that says this is law and not a lynching. The old man sputters, we do not need papers to know betrayal. Avery's voice sharpens, a blade finding its edge. Then you do not have justice. You have revenge. And revenge is not yours to take. Not anymore. A woman's voice rises from the back, raw and ragged with grief. She let them live, the soldiers who bombed our children, who burned our homes. She saved them. Avery turns toward the voice and sees a mother, perhaps, or a widow, someone hollowed out by loss and desperate to fill the void with meaning. Did she pull the triggers? He asks, softer now, but no less firm. Did she load the bombers? Did she give the orders? Avery demands. She gave them mercy, the woman chokes out, while we had none. Then she was a nurse, Avery says simply, doing what nurses do. Verraterend, someone shouts from the edge of the crowd, traitor, the word thrown like a stone. Others pick it up, a chant half-hearted but growing hotter, the mob trying to remember why it gathered, trying to reconvince itself. Avery sees it then, the ringleader. Not the old man, not the wounded veteran, but a younger man in his late 20s standing 3 rows back, wearing an expensive coat despite the ruin. Clean-shaven, eyes cold and calculating, the kind of man who never throws stones himself but always knows when to point at the target. This one didn't lose family, he lost standing, lost something the war took from him, and now he needs someone to pay. Her officer, the ringleader, says smoothly, stepping forward with a politician's practiced ease. The women were loaded onto trucks and driven north to a repurposed country estate in Shropshire that now served as a POW facility for female auxiliary personnel. There were high fences, yes, and guards, but the barracks were weatherproof, heated with coal stoves, and equipped with proper latrines. That first evening, they were served dinner, boiled potatoes, tinned beef, bread, margarine, and tea. It wasn't luxury, but it was more than Margaret had eaten in a single meal in weeks. She ate slowly, methodically, unwilling to let her body believe this was sustainable. Around her, two younger women wept silently into their plates. Another sat motionless, staring at the bread as though it might vanish. No one spoke. The quiet was not peace, it was disbelief, suspended. Within a week, the women were assigned to agricultural labor details. The ringleader can see the mud on his uniform, the sleepless days in his eyes, the war that has made him older than 26. You are correct, Avery says quietly in English, letting the foreignness of it assert itself, then switching back to German. I am one man, but I am the man with the rifle and the authority of His Majesty's armed forces. And if you touch her again, you will learn exactly how much one man can do when he decides the law matters more than the mob. The ringleader's smile falters. Avery pivots, addressing the crowd now, his voice carrying, "This woman is under British protective custody. Any attempt to harm her will be considered an act of aggression against Allied forces and will be met accordingly. If you have charges, submit them in writing to military government. If you have evidence, present it to a proper tribunal. Until then, she is not yours." The old man tries once more, his voice shaking. "But I know what she did," Avery interrupts, "though he doesn't, not yet, and I know what you want to do, but wanting is not the same as being right, and being angry is not the same as being just." He turns to the post, the woman's eyes track him, exhausted, weary, waiting for the next cruelty. "Fräulein," he says, voice low enough that only she hears. "I am Lieutenant Avery, British Army. I'm going to cut the rope now. Do you understand?" She nods, barely, a movement as small as a prayer. Avery draws his knife, the blade catches the gray light and reflects nothing back. The rope, cheap hemp frayed at the edges and tied with the sort of knot used to tether animals, parts under pressure and falls away like a spell breaking. The woman collapses forward and Avery catches her, his arm around her shoulders, steadying her weight against his chest. She weighs almost nothing, war has rationed even the substance of bodies. "S is for bye," he murmurs. "It's over." Her breath shudders against his uniform behind him. The crowd does not cheer, does not riot, it simply disperses slowly, reluctantly, like smoke losing its shape. The ringleader melts back into the rubble. The old man spits once more and turns away. The mother with the ragged voice covers her face and weeps. Corporal Dors appears at Avery's elbow. "Sir, ambulance is 2 minutes out." "Good." Avery shifts his grip, lifts the woman fully, cradling her like something breakable, which she is, which they all are. As he carries her across the square toward the waiting section, he feels it, the cost of choosing. His hands are steady, his orders were clear, but something inside him has shifted, a weight redistributed. The war was never impersonal, but it had been distant, a thing of maps and objectives, movements and missions. Now it is this, a woman's pulse against his forearm, a village's hatred in his wake, a choice made not because it was ordered but because it was necessary. He has crossed a line he cannot uncross. When the ambulance arrives, olive drab with red cross painted bright on the canvas, he hands her over to the medics with the careful precision of someone passing a lit candle in the dark. "Take her to the aid station," he tells the driver. "Protective custody. No visitors without my clearance." The driver nods, professional. "Understood, sir." Avery steps back and watches the ambulance pull away, tires grinding gravel and ash. The square is empty now except for his section. The post stands alone, the sign still nailed above, Veradarin. Dors clears his throat. "Orders, sir?" Avery looks at the post for a long moment, then reaches up and wrenches the sign free with both hands. The wood splinters, the nails shriek. He drops it to the ground, letting it lie face down in the mud. "We move out in 10, he says. "Check the perimeter. Mark this square secure." "And the woman, sir?" Avery turns to his corporal. Dors has been with him since Normandy, seen every kind of hell, never asked a question that wasn't necessary. The woman, Avery says slowly, is no longer their problem. She's ours. The field hospital tent smells of canvas, iodine, and the staleness of air cycled through too many lungs. Avery sits on an overturned crate beside the cot, watching the woman sleep. She has been unconscious for 4 hours. The medic, a Scotsman named Mloud with hands like a watchmaker, has catalogued her injuries with clinical precision: 2 cracked ribs, severe dehydration, contusions mapping her back like a failed geography lesson, rope burns encircling both wrists. She'll wake, Mloud said, body's just demanding the rest they're owed. The women sang tentatively at first, then with gathering strength. When the service ended, the chaplain distributed small parcels: a chocolate bar, a pair of wool socks, a packet of biscuits from the parish. They wanted you to have something, he said. Margaret held the chocolate and thought of Christmases before the war, her mother's kitchen, her brother's laughter, the smell of Lebkuchen baking. She cried quietly, and no one stopped her. In early 1946, censored male privileges expanded. Margaret was allowed to write home twice a month. Her letters were reviewed by British intelligence but rarely redacted unless they contained details about camp locations or military infrastructure. She wrote carefully, aware that anything she said could be used as propaganda by either side. But she also wrote truthfully, I am treated fairly here. We work on a farm. The food is adequate. I am not beaten. I am not starved. The British are strict but not cruel. I do not know when I will come home, but I am alive and I am whole. Her mother's reply, when it finally arrived in March, was shaken: we were told you were dead. We were told prisoners were executed. I wept for you for months. Thank God. Thank God. Margaret realized, holding that letter, that the propaganda had poisoned both sides. Her mother had believed the worst. Margaret had believed the worst. Both had been wrong. And that wrongness was the crack through which doubt could enter. If you're beginning to see how deeply propaganda shaped every corner of this war and how fragile those illusions were, subscribe now. The full picture is always more complicated than the myths. By spring 1946, the camp had established a small library stocked with German-language books donated by aid organizations and a handful of English novels for those learning the language. Margaret borrowed a copy of Pride and Prejudice and labored through it with a dictionary. Margaret was fascinated by the ordinariness of the world. Pride and Prejudice described a world where the greatest crisis was a misunderstood proposal. A music club formed. Several women had been trained musicians before the war, and the camp commandant allowed them to practice in the recreation hall twice a week. They sang German lieder, British folk songs, and even a few American standards taught to them by a visiting U.S. liaison officer. The Americans were a revelation in themselves. They arrived in June 1946 as part of an inter-allied coordination effort, inspecting POW camps to ensure consistent standards. Margaret's first sight of a U.S. officer, a young captain from Ohio, chewing gum and speaking in an accent she found nearly incomprehensible, was jarring. He was friendly, aggressively friendly. He asked the women if they had complaints, if they were being treated well, and if they needed anything. He took notes. He smiled constantly. He called them ladies. After he left, one of the older women muttered, "Are all Americans like that?" "I think so," Margaret said. Exhausting, but also strangely reassuring. The Americans had no personal stake in the European war's bitterness. They treated the prisoners with the same brisk, procedural courtesy they seemed to apply to everything. Another signal that the war's hatreds were not universal, not inevitable. Civilization, Margaret was learning, was a choice that could be made even in the midst of ruin. Not every guard was patient. Not every interaction was smooth. In August, a young British corporal, new to the camp and barely 20, lost his temper when one of the women spoke back during a work assignment. He raised his voice, stepped too close, and for a moment it seemed violence might follow. It didn't. The camp sergeant intervened immediately, pulled the corporal aside, and dressed him down in clipped, furious English. Margaret couldn't hear every word, but the tone was unmistakable. "You don't do that here." The corporal was reassigned the next day. The message was clear. The barbed wire was the punishment. The isolation was the punishment. Cruelty was not policy, and those who practiced it would not remain. It was a small incident, but it mattered because it demonstrated that restraint was not weakness. It was discipline, the kind that held even when no one was watching. By late 1946, restrictions had loosened considerably. Margaret and several others were allowed supervised walks beyond the camp perimeter on Sunday afternoons. Eventually, the supervision was dropped. They walked the Shropshire lanes in pairs, breathing air that smelled of hay and wood smoke, and no one stopped them. They could have run. The hedgerows offered cover. The villages offered anonymity. But where would they go? Germany was rubble. Repatriation was coming. And truthfully, life in the camp had settled into something bearable, almost routine. Some of the women began volunteering for extra shifts during harvest season, driven by a strange pride in their competence. They weren't fighting for Britain, but they were proving something to themselves, that they could work with dignity, that their labor had value, that they were more than what the war had tried to make them. Mr. Hargreaves noticed. One evening, as they loaded the last milk cans onto the truck, he said, "You've done good work here. Better than I expected." It was the closest thing to affection he'd ever offered. Margaret nodded. "Thank you." And she meant it. Late at night, lying in her bunk with the mug of evening tea cooling on the floor beside her, Margaret turned the question over and over. If the propaganda about Allied cruelty was false, and it was demonstrably false, what else had been a lie? The necessity of the war, the righteousness of the cause, the demonization of the enemy. She didn't have answers, but the questions themselves were dangerous, destabilizing, freeing. Years later, in a letter to Mrs. Hargreaves, one of dozens exchanged over 3 decades, Margaret would write, "I learned more about strength in that camp than I ever did in uniform. Real strength is not domination. It is restraint. It is the choice to be decent when cruelty would be easier. You and your husband taught me that, though you never said it aloud." The lesson was quiet, but it was permanent. Repatriation began in earnest in early 1947. Most of the women returned to Germany, uncertain of what awaited them. The country was divided, destroyed, occupied. Families were scattered. Homes were ruins. A few chose to stay in Britain temporarily, accepting contracts as agricultural workers while they saved money or waited for better information about conditions back home. Margaret stayed until the autumn of 1947. She worked the harvest one last time, attended a final Sunday dinner with the Hargreaves family, and accepted a small parcel for the journey, tea, biscuits, and a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice with a note tucked inside. "Remember that decency is always a choice. Safe travels. Write if you can." She did write for 30 years. The letters traveled back and forth, awkward at first, then warm, then familial. Margaret rebuilt her life in Hamburg, married a teacher, and raised 2 children. She never spoke much about the war, but she kept the tin mug. She kept it on her kitchen shelf, dented and dull. And sometimes, when her children asked about it, she would say only, "It's from England." It reminds me that people are complicated. The war had taught millions that strength was violence, that victory required vengeance, that the enemy was less than human. But in a camp in Shropshire, in a dairy cooperative, in a farmhouse kitchen, a different lesson was taught. Not through speeches, but through small, repeated acts of restraint. Tea offered, wounds tended, work respected, dignity maintained. It wasn't kindness. It was something harder, civilization choosing itself, even when brutality would have been easier. Margaret learned that strength is not what you do to your enemies when you have power over them. Strength is what you refuse to do. Before you go, subscribe. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and why. The tin mug sat on Margaret's shelf for 40 years, dented and unremarkable. But every time she made tea, she remembered that the measure of a nation is not its weapons, but its restraints.